Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World, where every word matters. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. President Donald Trump is pushing forward with plans to impose hefty tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China, citing fentanyl trafficking as a key reason. The move has sparked concerns about inflation, potential trade retaliation. Meanwhile, Senator Marco Rubio is visiting Panama to mark the 30th anniversary of Panama Canal's handover, raising questions about U.S. influence in the region and its stance on China's growing presence. Joining us today on TVP World to discuss these developments is Alberto Coll, professor at DePaul University College of Law. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Good evening. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's first take a look at the tariff situation, because we do know that Trump traditionally likes to use tariff as a leveraging negotiation tool. So, I mean, we've seen the Colombia situation where once tariff is threatened, they kind of very quickly change their tunes. Do you think this is the same approach that Trump is taking when it comes to the Canadian-Mexican situation, or does this signify a broader policy shift?
I think he definitely intends to use these tariffs as bargaining leverage with both Canada and the United States. I mean, we know that Donald Trump, over the past 40 years, even before he went into politics, always has had this penchant for tariffs and this idea that U.S. allies, including friends as well as rivals, such as China, supposedly take advantage of the United States, by which he means they have trade surpluses with the United States. Donald Trump doesn't like the United States having trade deficits. He thinks that this means lower American employment. So, but I think that on the whole, these tariffs are an opening gambit in a process of negotiation. With regards to Mexico, he is very concerned about the tremendous amount of fentanyl, and he also wants Mexico to take strong measures to deter further immigration. In the case of Canada, again, Trump doesn't like the fact that, number one, Canada has a trade surplus with the United States. But secondly, Trump also has referred to the fact that Canada right now is among the lowest countries in the NATO alliance in terms of contributing a proportion of their GDP to defense. And Trump thinks this is really unacceptable, that there's no excuse for Canada right now, for example, spending about 1.7% of its GDP on defense, when the United States spends twice as much, 3.4% of its GDP on defense. And many of our European allies right now are spending at least 2%, 2.5%. Poland, for example, is spending over 4.5% of its GDP on defense. And Trump thinks that Canada has to change its policy on this.
Now, a lot of European leaders, Europeans as a whole, are pretty on edge and wondering if that tariff is going to also hit the EU as well. Do you think that is a likely possibility? Or do you think that perhaps there are some other concerns that Donald Trump wants to pursue and perhaps use, again, these tariffs as a leverage tool for their negotiation?
In the past, Trump has talked about the EU also having a trade surplus with the United States, even though, again, the United States provides a great deal of the EU's military capabilities in terms of, for example, the American nuclear umbrella. So you can expect that first there will be this tariff tussle with Canada, Mexico, and, of course, with China. But at some point, I think Trump will also go back to the idea of at least talking about imposing tariffs on the EU. And there will be a give and take. Already some EU leaders, notably Christine Lagarde and also Ursula von der Leyen, have talked about Europe buying more American liquefied natural gas and even American oil. So I think that you could expect that this will be, again, part of negotiations, and that in the end, even if Trump does place some tariffs on the EU, those tariffs eventually will come down, will be withdrawn, if the Europeans are able to make some concessions that Trump can point to.
A lot of people are already talking about the economical implications when it comes to these tariffs, not just like when it comes to Europe, Mexico, Canada, but also domestically, citing inflation, prices going up, and all the negative impact that this would bring about. Do you think that perhaps we're getting a little bit of ourselves and already going to like kind of the long-term effects of these tariffs without first considering perhaps this again is just some sort of negotiation tactic, and we might actually be looking at a very different reality than we are like predicting this whole doom and gloom situation?
I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of people already are mapping out these scenarios where the tariffs not only are imposed, but stay there and cause massive price increases across the United States. Well, as you pointed out, we really don't know. These tariffs are, I think, a bargaining chip. And it depends exactly on what happens next. The tariffs could lead, for example, to better trade terms all around between the United States and some of its trading partners. And some of the tariffs might stay in place, but they might affect only goods that are largely symbolic, or goods that the United States might be able to purchase or even manufacture on its own more cheaply. So we just don't know. I don't think we should rush into these long-term scenarios. Obviously, economists worry about tariffs because not only of their inflationary impact, because sometimes also they can set off a tit for tat that could wind up hurting American exports as well. But we are far from being there yet. And remember, Trump's Secretary of the Treasury has come out. And we know his background. We know what he's been writing and saying for decades. He's a very prominent, very bright economist in his own right. And he does not believe in high tariffs. And I think he will try to talk Trump into tariffs, if at all, that are very targeted and that are very modest and that can be used as a bargaining chip as opposed to hurting the American consumer.
Right, so we'll have to see how Trump makes his decision going forward before we can dig a little bit more into that topic. And in the meantime, I would like to also turn our attention to the Panama Canal with Senator Rubio's visit. In the context of U.S.-Latin American relations, how do you think that is going to affect things?
Well, so the United States is often accused of neglecting Latin America, and there is something to that criticism that the United States is always so busy dealing with European affairs, Asian affairs, the Middle East, and that often the United States does not spend sufficient attention or diplomatic energy on the region. Now, Marco Rubio has broken that paradigm by making this major trip to Latin America. We know that Senator Rubio, because of his work on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee over the past decade, is very, very invested in Latin America. And there are several areas that he's going to be discussing in this trip. Number one, Rubio does not want to give any kind of breathing space to the governments in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and in Cuba. He's a very strong opponent of these three governments, and he wants to make sure that a future Trump policy continues to keep pressure on these three governments to kind of nudge them towards democratization. Mm-hmm. Secondly, Rubio wants to make sure that our Latin American allies understand that they cannot allow or in any way be participants in the process of large numbers of persons moving through their territories to reach the United States. So you're already seeing, for example, Panama has increased law enforcement operations to make sure that Panamanian territory is not used by persons who are trying to go through the Darien jungle in Panama to eventually reach the United States. So migration will be a second issue. And then thirdly, in the case of Panama, I think Rubio is looking for a way in which the Panamanians can negotiate with the United States some kinds of assurances that over time, China will not have a prominent role in the port operations around the canal. I mean, right now, the Wall Street Journal just came out with a very interesting study showing that the Chinese companies that are present in the Panama Canal control only about 36% of the volume of goods that go through the canal. The rest is controlled by entities, including entities controlled by American shareholders. So it's not as if China has a stranglehold of any sort on the canal, But Trump is very alert to these kinds of concerns. And I think Rubio is trying to make sure that some kind of deal can be reached with the Panamanians to assuage President Trump's concerns. Remember, Panama right now has a very pro-American government. It's a conservative government, very friendly to the United States. So the last thing that Marco Rubio wants to do is push the Panamanians away from a pro-U.S. position. So look for some kind of a deal that is worked out to make sure that the issue of Panama kind of goes away. Certainly the Panama Canal is not on the table as far as the United States taking it over again. And this is why Rubio timed his visit with the anniversary of the handing over of the canal to the Panamanians. It's a subtle message to the Panamanians saying, look, at the end of the day, we're not interested in taking over the canal, but we do want to make sure that the canal remains friendly to American interests.
Right. So do you think this talks about taking it over is, again, another one of those instances where the Trump administration talk things, make requests all the way up there and just talk their way down to a middle ground that they find acceptable?
Yes, and we saw this in his first term. He made a lot of demands, imposed a lot of high tariffs, and at the end, often many of these things were opening moves in a negotiation process where he felt he received some concessions. Remember with NATO, he came in the last time around saying we're not going to remain in NATO. Well, if NATO doesn't step up its military spending. By the time he left, our NATO allies had increased their military spending substantially, and they are on their way to increasing their military spending even further. And the United States was still in NATO when Donald Trump left office. And today, Donald Trump is not planning to pull the United States out of NATO.
Right. So can we see patterns from how Trump's doing things from his first week when it comes to all these different trade relations, the way he deals with foreign leaders, and kind of read the tea leaves a little bit to get a grasp of how Donald Trump will be governing going forward and how perhaps European leaders will be able to negotiate, discuss with the U.S. president?
Well, as many people have noted, that this is a very transactional president. He doesn't give much weight to sentimental relationships, to traditional ways of doing things. He's also not a traditional diplomat. He believes in doing diplomacy and in putting pressure on other countries through tweets and through public statements. And you can expect him to put pressure on countries to make them do things that he believes will be in the interest of the United States. I mean, we saw that recently with Colombia, when the Colombian president decided to stop those 2 American planes from landing in Bogota with Colombian migrants. Trump immediately responded with threats to raise tariffs massively on Colombia. He got results there, but this is going to be part of a pattern. On the whole, one of the interesting things that we will have to look for is, number one, is Trump is going to try to strike some kind of a grand bargain in the Middle East, for example, with Iran. He has a very hostile policy towards Iran, but sometimes he has hinted that he's open to some diplomatic accommodation with Iran if Iran is willing to make concessions. Secondly, let's look at the issue of the Middle East in terms of the Palestinians. Trump very much wants the Israelis and the Saudis to normalize relations. The Saudis are insisting that for that to happen, a Palestinian 2-state solution has to be accepted by Israel. Let's see whether Trump is prepared to push Prime Minister Netanyahu to accept that. That will be very interesting to watch. And then thirdly, let's look at Ukraine and exactly whether Trump can get President Putin to the table to negotiate a meaningful agreement that can hold and that can still preserve Ukrainian sovereignty.
Right.
So those are big issues that are still not even fully on the table.
Definitely. And we do have to observe and see how things turn out. In the meantime, thank you so much for breaking all of this down and your input and insight. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you for your kindness. It's always a great pleasure.
Cheers.
Bye.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.